to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to the next episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Talia Betcher, and I'm with my friends and co-hosts Lee Johnson and Rick Lee. And today, our topic is cringe. But before we get there, Lee, what is your drink order and what is your deep, dark confession?
Well, the weather's getting warmer, so I think I'm going to have a frozen margarita to drink. And my barstool confession today, and this is related somewhat to our topic for this episode, is that I actually love icebreakers.
Oh, no. Lee, I've known you 25 years. If I had known this, we never would have become friends.
I knew it right away. It was obvious to me.
I know people hate them. I know why they hate them, but I just can't help myself. It's like living in an actual suspense movie as you're there in a meeting. And I'm just always so excited to see what's going to happen when we go around the horn with the icebreakers.
Oh my
I've
God.
never been disappointed. So that's mine. Sorry, guys. That's just the way it is.
That's perfect for today's topic, if you think about it.
Yeah.
It really is.
Rick, what about you? What are you drinking today, and what is your confession?
I'm going to have a mezcalita, which is a margarita with mezcal because I like the smokiness of mezcal. And my confession is, and this will come as no surprise to anyone, I am incredibly disorganized. So today I realized what is obvious to everyone except me. When I opened my email and found 3 emails about deadlines I had missed, things I failed to submit, I lost track of the emails, I don't have a to-do list, and I just realized I am an incredibly disorganized human being. And I'm sorry to everyone for my disorganization.
You're forgiven. You're forgiven.
I have a deep, deep love of the to-do list.
I have whiteboards all over my apartment.
Tell you, what about you? What are you drinking and what's your confession?
Well, today I think I'm going to have a virgin Bloody Mary. And, okay, so here's my confession. I don't think that Judith Butler is all that difficult to understand.
Totally agree.
I think that they've had a very bad rap. All you got to do is make a little bit of an effort to learn the jargon. And you know what? Making an effort is part of doing philosophy. I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
So put in an effort, get off your ass, do the work. You scratch it, you put in the work, and then you really see the brilliance. And I think that you contrast that with other philosophers who are difficult to understand. You know, I'm thinking of you, Deleuze.
Deleuze, a well-known fan of the podcast.
Yeah, a lovely colleague got me turned on to Deleuze, Jay Conway. And, you know, I've become convinced that Deleuze is not brilliant, but my colleague Jay Conway is brilliant. I think there's a difference. Yeah, I think Butler's got an unfair rap.
One of my former students, Gil Morejón, once said that he often thinks Deleuze is more clever than smart.
So, Lee, today we're talking about cringe. What is cringe and why are we talking about it?
Imagine that you're at a wedding where the best man's speech has taken a deeply unfortunate turn. Maybe he's trying to be edgy, but he ends up oversharing about the groom's exes and crying halfway through. Or maybe you're in a work meeting where someone turns a lighthearted icebreaker, my favorite thing, like what's your go-to weekend activity, into this 10-minute confession about their divorce and spiritual rebirth. Or you're at a party watching someone swing and miss with an awkward pickup line, loud, earnest, and utterly misread for the room, and then double down instead of retreat.
Yeah.
There's a certain kind of feeling that hits you in the gut. It's not quite disgust, not quite fear, not quite shame, and yet somehow all of these things at once. And most often, it's not caused by what's happening to you, but by what you're seeing someone else do. Wherever you are, that feeling, that skin-crawling, slow-motion horror of watching someone completely miss the mark is what we call cringe. Now, the word cringe itself is pretty old. Its roots go back to Old English, where it literally meant to bend or to shrink. So it started as a physical gesture, flinching, recoiling, shrinking away from something unpleasant. But in the last couple of decades, especially with the rise of the internet and social media, cringe has morphed into something much more complex, a whole cultural mode of judgment, a way of feeling, a genre, a meme, and increasingly a weapon. What makes cringe philosophically interesting is that it's never just about taste or embarrassment. It's about what happens when someone's performance of their self breaks down in front of others, when the social choreography fails and the illusion of shared norms flicker. Cringe is contagious because it reveals how precarious our own performances are. When we laugh at someone else's awkwardness, what we're often doing is scrambling to reassure ourselves, I know the rules. I would never do that. But let's be honest, we've all been there. We've all posted something we wish we hadn't, made a joke that tanked, worn the wrong thing, said too much, cared too loudly. Cringe is the tax we pay for being visible, like a toll booth on the road to sociality. So brace yourself, because this episode is going to be awkward. As you might expect, I'd like for us in this first section to try to get at the root of what actually cringe is. At least try to venture a definition. I think it's a lot of things. As I said in the intro, I think it's kind of an affective rupture in many ways, a moment when somebody else's social performance fails so conspicuously that we not only notice it, but we feel it in our own bodies. I want to venture this, and feel free to disagree, but I think philosophically cringe operates on multiple levels. So there's an aesthetic level, like it's a violation of taste in the Kantian sense. I think it operates on a moral level because there is, as we all know, a whiff of judgment, however petty or sanctimonious. And then I also think that it operates on an ontological level. It reveals the way that the self is always already performative, or fragile, or contingent, whatever word you want to use there. So here's what I'd like to do. I want us to get at a definition of cringe, but here in this first section, I'd really like us to focus on the first philosophical level of it, the aesthetic level.
When I was thinking about the topic of cringe, the first thing that came into my mind was cringe comedy and its association with humor. It's not just judgment, but it's laughing at the cringe performer. It's not just humor. It's being shocked. It's aghast. There's like a train wreck that we can't look away from. Okay, so I'm thinking my favorite character in the television show Succession.
Sure.
Is Kendall Roy. I love me some Kendall Roy. And Kendall Roy is cringe incarnate. Everything about him is cringe. Everything he ever does is cringe.
Yeah.
And there is this one performance that he does for his father, Logan Roy, hip-hop performance. L to the O-G-A-N, and it is so hilarious. It is one of the funniest things you will ever see. And when he does it, he's performing it at this function, and so many people are like quietly laughing and mocking him. Anyway, my point is this. I'll come back to Kendall just because I love his cringe so much. There is this humor factor. I'm thinking also of the specials they used to do, Mortified Nation, in which people would go up on stage and read their old bad poetry.
Yeah.
And there's something about it that's just hysterical.
But not meant to be funny.
Not when you wrote it. But it's being served up now as cringe, and it's meant to be laughed at.
But can I go back to one thing you slipped in there? Because I think we need to emphasize it much more. And that is, it's not just laughter, but you slipped in laugh awkwardly.
Yeah.
I laugh differently at, for example, the scene from the I Love Lucy show where she and Vivian are working in the chocolate factory and the chocolates are coming down the conveyor belt way too fast and they start eating them, they start shoving them in their hat and so on. Mm-hmm. I laugh differently at that than I do, for example, at The Office when Michael says something cringeworthy. I might be laughing, but it's a different kind of laughter. And I wonder here if the French philosopher Henri Bergson wouldn't be helpful. Bergson argues that laughter is a social call to one another to say, hey, you're not acting like a human. You're acting like an automaton. This laughter at cringe is a kind of call to someone saying, hey, you're not being human in the right way. But that's a different kind of laughter than when I laugh at the I Love Lucy scene or, a similar scene from the Dick Van Dyke Show.
No, I agree. It's a very distinctive form of humor. And I would also think that were I there in the situation where a person is being cringy, the laughter would be very different from the laughter I would have when I was watching it on a movie or TV show.
Right.
Being part of it is different. And this is one of the points that I think Lee is making. You're stuck in the situation and you can't maybe escape. You're part of it, whether you want to be or not. And that's a very different condition.
I want to say a couple of things. First, I don't think that cringe is a form of humor. I think often when we laugh at cringe moments, it's a coping mechanism.
Right.
I don't think that it's meant to be funny. I don't think that we actually find it funny, as you both are saying, in the way that we find other things comedic. I think, just speaking from a Kantian perspective, cringe is a kind of aesthetic offense. So you remember in the Critique of Judgment that judgments of taste are subjective, but they, according to Kant, carry a claim to universal assent. We expect others to agree with us when we say something is beautiful or tasteful. And I think cringe flips that script. So when we cringe, it's not because somebody violated my personal private preferences. It's because their self-presentation has failed in a way that seems universally wrong. It's as if we're witnessing a failure of aesthetic propriety, a breach of what ought to be harmonious. And it's hard to really point the finger at what causes that. Sometimes it's the tone, the timing, the posture, the context, whatever it is. But whatever it is, it's grating against our shared sense of what belongs there, what should be there. So the intensity of our reaction, I think, betrays like how fragile and historically contingent our aesthetic norms are. And cringe is a very unique affective state, aesthetic state that is not like comedy. It's not like embarrassment. It's not like shame, and yet kind of includes all of those things.
I sort of agree, but I sort of disagree, Lee, because I think that it might be the case that this aesthetic failure is more integral to cringe. Mm-hmm. But I certainly think that humor is closely related to it, to the extent that cringe becomes ridiculous or absurd. And aesthetic failures tend in that direction to become ridiculous, to become absurd. They're going to be funny. And if you think of a lot of humor trades on that, especially old classic humor like the pie in the face kind of thing. Humor trades with the ugly. I mean, it is a genre, cringe comedy. That is a thing that exists. And so to say that there's no correlation between cringe and comedy, or that cringe has nothing to do with comedy, is, I think, not right. And it seems to me that you can have conflicting aesthetic values going on at once. I think that you're right to point to the centrality of aesthetic failure as key to cringe. I was merely adding on and saying I think that there could be different aesthetic components to cringe, one being the comedic aspect that stems from its ridiculousness. When we laugh at someone's misfortune, someone slips on a banana peel, ha ha ha. This is a more sophisticated form of that. Someone fails at maintaining their social self-presentation, right? Or they fail dramatically at executing a social script in the way that they're supposed to. They misread the situation.
I think what I would want to say is that cringe comedy is different than actual cringe, because I think that there is a craft to comedy. And I think one of the ways that one could craft a comedic sketch, for example, is to play on this real life example of cringe that we often have. But when we actually experience cringe, we experience it because what we're witnessing was not crafted. It was not scripted.
I think what you're pointing out, Lee, is that we laugh at all sorts of things that aren't comedy. We laugh when someone trips when they're walking down the street. babies laugh at peekaboo. Remove your hands from your face and say peekaboo, and children laugh. So to say that we laugh at something is not to say that it is that genre that we would call comedy. That would be my first point. The second thing is, I agree wholeheartedly, Lee, that there are situations that are cringe, that when I'm witnessing them, let's say in real life, I don't know that I would laugh, or if I did, it would be a kind of nervous laughter, which is a way to try to cover for the person who is being cringe. So when I laugh, I'm saying, oh, yeah, she's kidding, or, oh, it's a joke. I'm trying to give them some kind of social cover, but I don't think that's comedy.
I want to make a distinction here, and then I'll let this point go. But I think that there's comedy as in something that you would write or script, but I'm getting more towards the aesthetics of humor and what makes something funny. When we think about humor, we needn't think about it within the scripted confines of comedy. Of course, not all comedy is scripted, but humor does reside in the world. Humor is an aesthetic. And so the question, what makes something funny, what makes us laugh, is...
But I want to distinguish those. What makes something funny is not the same as what makes us laugh.
Yeah, sure.
Let's say there are two different scenarios, and I laugh in both scenarios, but I can make a definitional distinction and say one of them was funny and one of them was cringe.
One could. It depends on one's theory of humor, of course, or theory of the funny. One could argue that the funny is what makes us laugh. I mean, that is one account of the funny. So it depends. However, I do think that there is something of the funny in the cringe.
I agree that there's something funny in the cringe. I just think there's a difference between cringe funny and other kinds of funny.
Okay, I agree with that.
And I'm trying to get at what is aesthetically unique about cringe that is different than other kinds of funny or other kinds of comedy.
I've been thinking about your notion of an aesthetic failure. And I could think of aesthetics in two ways. One would be broadly Kantian, and the other would also be Kantian, but would take in other aesthetic theories. So the first would be, Kant famously argues in the Third Critique that we call something, for example, beautiful. That's an aesthetic judgment because it seems like it is made on purpose, but it has no purpose. And so there's some craft, as you said, Lee, that it seems to present us with, but it doesn't present us with anything for which this is crafted. And when we confront that, we say, that's beautiful. Now, if that shows up, and instead of judging it to be beautiful, we judge it to be ugly, there still is a purpose there, but we kind of miss that purpose. And one way I could capture that is then to go to a different way people often talk about aesthetics, namely the relationship between form and content. And I would argue that something that is cringe has the form of a readily recognizable social enactment of something, and yet the content of it doesn't match the form. The content of it fails to live up to the form. And that is the aesthetic failure of it. That calling it an aesthetic failure is really interesting here, even if it is at the same time a social failure and an affective failure. It could be a failure on many levels, but I think on the aesthetic level, it's really interesting in this not being, in terms of its content, what it's presenting to be in terms of its form.
I want to go back to Talia's example of Kendall Roy from Succession, which is such a great example. And apologies to listeners who haven't watched Succession. It's a fantastic show. You should watch it.
Yeah.
Kendall Roy is very, very, very cringe. And of course, is not trying to be funny. As a matter of fact, part of the reason why his cringe is so intense is because he's trying to be so authentic, so real.
Yeah.
And there's another character on the same series, Greg, who is also very cringe. But he's cringe because of his awkwardness. And yet, Greg also is trying to be very authentic, very real, trying to very much fit in. And it is the failure of fitting into the scene, fitting into the context, having the right tone, having the right timing. All of that is what makes their performances, and I don't think that they're actually performances, but their actions, cringe instead of humorous or funny or comedic, let me say. They are funny, but they're not comedic. I wonder if it's the case that part of the reason that we find them funny is because we are implicated in the failure of the performance, the failure that is enacted in the actual action. Though what we're seeing, as I said in the intro, what we're seeing is a way in which I might also fail that way. And so, Rick, you said earlier there's a kind of nervous laughter that comes along with it. And I think nervous laughter is much more the kind of laughter that comes along with cringe. And that nervous laughter is, I know the rules. I know this is not following the rules. This is cringe, but for the grace of God go I, right?
Which is why I said also that we laugh as a social protection for the other person. So my laughter covers your faux pas or your misaction because there but for the grace of God go I.
I think that there's a difference, though. It's not just that the person is not fitting in, not conforming to a social code. I think what's key in cringe is that the person in question must be unaware of the fact. It's the earnestness and the lack of awareness, because you can have someone who is a misfit, someone who is socially awkward, and quite aware that they're socially awkward, quite aware that they're not fitting in. Or you can have a social mishap befall someone. They fall, whatever, they drop a cake on themselves. People turn and they start laughing at them. That's not cringe, that you're laughing at their humiliation or whatever that is. What makes it cringe is that the person must not know. They must think they're doing a great job.
I totally agree with that.
Part of what makes it cringe is that they're not in on the joke.
Can I also just point out that it's not always funny?
I know, I'm sorry, just because I think cringe is hilarious.
No. I agree that it's often funny, and often we laugh even though it's not funny. Mm-hmm. But I also want to go back to a couple of the examples that I offered before, like the best man at a wedding that gives a cringe speech. Or, in an icebreaker, when somebody gives a cringe answer to an icebreaker question. I think that sometimes... No, often those are funny or we nervously laugh at them. But I often experience many different other affects.
Oh, for sure. Mortification
sometimes that
at
makes
the time,
me feel, sometimes that makes me feel nauseous. Sometimes that makes me feel incredible anxiety. Sometimes that makes me feel shame as if I did it, or shame for being there, for even witnessing it.
I agree.
And all of those things, I think, again, distinguish cringe as a really unique affective response to a really unique aesthetic event.
I agree with that completely. I mean, it's not just humor. I think it's the plethora of feelings that we feel, particularly in the moment. Watching cringe on television is one thing, but being in the moment when cringe is experienced, that's an entirely different phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it can be extremely unpleasant. You want to flee. You can't flee.
Yeah.
You're trapped and it's like a car wreck and you can't leave. Part of you feels bad for the person and part of you feels possibly unhappy with the person. Like, why are they doing this?
And it's not schadenfreude. It's different. It's something else.
It is.
There's an empathy that you're pointing out there, Lee, that is required. And I think it goes back to this point you keep insisting on, namely that I see myself in their place. As smooth and as cool and slick as I think I am, I know I could misread the cues. I know I could be really sincere about something that is utterly ridiculous. I know that I could give the bad best man speech. This is why I keep insisting laughter is a form of social embrace. Like, oh no, they meant it. Oh, I'm laughing because this is what you intended. Otherwise, this is awkward for you and it's awkward for me because I feel like I could be there myself. So I think it's not just an aesthetic judgment, or the aesthetic judgment depends on some other factors that are operating.
And I think the more vulnerable the person performing the cringe moment is, the less funny it is.
Yes.
I agree.
I think, for example, when you see depictions, whether it's in film or television or actual life, depictions of, for example, teenage girls or boys doing something cringe, or people who are low-level workers in whatever domain of human life that are in very vulnerable positions. We don't laugh at those. We feel real pain. And it's partly empathetic, but it's also partly because we know what the consequences of this is going to be. It's not going to be funny.
I agree with that. And it sort of raises a further question about to what degree the aesthetic is shot through with the political. Sometimes it's not even an aesthetic failure, but a political failure.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Talia, because I think that brings to the fore one affect that I think we've left out of our discussion of a cringe experience, and that is anger. For example, I find J.D. Vance incredibly cringe.
Oh my God.
But I don't feel embarrassment. I don't feel sad. I don't feel like it's funny. It makes me angry to see his cringe moments.
But I think there is a sense of, if I were in your place, I would be embarrassed. You should be embarrassed. That you're not fucking pisses me off.
Yeah, exactly right.
Hey, it's Talia from Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where philosophers drink, argue, and occasionally make you question your life and your life choices. If you like what you hear, follow us on social media. We're on TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. Facebook still exists, and no, we're not just talking to your aunt. On TikTok, we post short clips of our wildest takes, most awkward debates, and those "did they just say that" moments. And on YouTube, you can catch full episodes, behind-the-scenes rants, and bonus content you're probably advised not to publish. Just search Hotel Bar Sessions, like, follow, subscribe, whatever the button says, and drop a comment if you're feeling brave. You might just get called out on the show.
I think there's an aspect of cringe that we haven't really uncovered yet, and that is that it often is something like an accusation.
Yeah.
Like I say, that's cringe. I want it to stop, or I'm trying to make some other judgment, not just aesthetic. And I'm wondering what's going on there when we accuse someone or something of being cringe.
I mean, I definitely agree that cringe has a very strong moral valence. And I think we could go back to, well, there's a lot of places we could go with this. We could go back to Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals, where he's describing moral codes as generated and enforced by the herd to basically punish difference or innovation or excess. And in that sense, calling something cringe could be an act of ressentiment, a way of asserting control over somebody whose experience threatens this collective sense of propriety. But I think also Foucault would see this as part of what he calls disciplinary power. From Discipline and Punish, he shows how modern power operates, not just through laws, but through these micro practices of surveillance and normalization.
Those all suggest there's something problematic with calling something cringe. Not that the cringy thing is the problem, but the very claim that that's cringe is an act of what we might call policing, saying, hey, we don't do that here. Stop it. That is a way of normalizing and leveling everything out. I think we often do it in what I would say is a positive thing. Like, hey, you don't know that what you're doing is cringy, but it is really cringy, so stop it right now. When it's an action or a behavior that I think we would all agree ought not to be happening.
I'm not sure I see the difference between those two things, because when I say to someone, the way you're acting is cringe, you really shouldn't do it. It's embarrassing. People are talking about you behind your back. That's just stating clearly the policing function, right? That's just actually policing instead of doing it through whatever surveillance as we normally would. I don't know. I mean, I think today, cringe culture, especially in its digital form, is like textbook Foucault. It's a crowdsourced panopticon. When we actually say to someone, a friend, that's really cringe, stop doing that, all we're doing is, just kind of reaching out and saying, hey, before the police come for you, let me tell you this as your friend. I don't think that what's actually happening is any different.
I think that makes a whole lot of sense, and I think to a large extent I do agree with this. Although I would like to carve out one exception. Maybe it's not even really an exception, but I do think that there are cringe cases where identifying them as cringe is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
I would love an example of one.
I think that when someone in power is politically cringe, I don't think that it's policing them to say that they're being cringy, or if it is policing them to point out that they're being like really politically gross.
Again, I'm not sure that I entirely see the distinction here. So policing, I'm using as a way of saying, making a judgment that is going to have punitive consequences in one way or another. And I think when I say that about JD Vance, when I say he's totally cringe, obviously I can't punish JD Vance for being cringe, but by pointing it out, I'm saying he ought to be punished. I'm taking on the police function, the surveilling disciplinary function there. I think that if something were cringe and didn't have that dimension to it, we wouldn't call it cringe. So let me give you an example. We might say to see a woman walking around without a bra on is cringe. We might say that now. But there was a point at which that particular activity, we would say, no, that's radical. It is breaking the norms. It is breaking the rules. But we recognize it as doing something that is other than cringe.
My problem, though, is that when we say policing, obviously it has hidden valuations built into it, and I don't see it as a neutral description, particularly when we let off with allusions to Nietzsche and herd morality.
I don't think it's neutral either. That's why I'm saying policing involves disciplining and punishing.
Right, exactly.
I don't think it's neutral.
Right, exactly. And when we've let off with Foucault's notion of the panopticon, all of these things then makes it seem like policing is a bad thing. I guess then what I'm saying is I don't know that policing is always a bad thing.
It depends who the police are.
Okay, I think I'm getting your point a little bit clearer now. So I agree that it is not always the case that policing is a bad thing, as Rick said, depending on who the police are. But it is the case that when we call something cringe, there is policing going on. If there weren't a kind of disciplinary and punishing function to that accusation, we wouldn't call it cringe, we would call it something else. We would call that behavior awkward or weird or whatever, but we wouldn't call it cringe.
Let's separate two different ways in which it can be punishing. And I think that this is important because one is behaviorally corrective and one is not.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with this point.
But I want to expand upon this because you gave the example of a friend who goes to another friend and goes, hey, that's cringe. Just want to give you a heads up, do you solid. So that friend then modifies that behavior. Where we're getting a sense of discipline and normalization and conformity to a certain kind of behavior. That is definitely within the auspices of metaphors like the panopticon and surveillance and ways in which we surveil each other. However, there's a different kind of way we identify something as cringe. And this goes back to your point about J.D. Vance. We don't go up to J.D. Vance and go, hey, that's cringe. In fact, it's kind of more fun to just laugh at Vance behind his back. It's actually part of cringe. Now remember, part of cringe is the person who is being cringy doesn't know they're being cringy, and we laugh at them. Part of cringe is you just go to your friends, hey, that's really cringy, check it out. And you sort of point out the cringe. Another way of identifying cringe is just to go, that's cringe. But you don't tell the cringeworthy person themselves that they're cringe. It's not clear that the second kind of identifying something as cringe is policing in the same way, because it does not have a necessarily normalizing function in terms of that individual's behavior.
But I wonder if we apply one of my favorite techniques, namely as opposed to what, some of the things we are talking about seem to be cringe, but others are just morally wrong. And I don't think everything that is morally wrong is cringe.
True.
And I don't think everything that is cringe is morally wrong.
Obviously.
And so if I say, following the comedian Demetri Martin, that I could make almost any statement cringe by just adding the word ladies onto the end of it. So I could say, hey, it's so great to see you, ladies. Then I take something that is pleasant and turn it into something cringe. And one might say, look, when I call that cringe, what I'm saying is stop it because it's wrong.
Okay, a couple of points here. First, I want to redouble my claim that I don't think that there's any difference between any of these examples that we're giving about calling something cringe. I think whether I call JD Vance cringe, whether I just say to the person sitting next to me in the meeting during the icebreaker, oh my God, that was so cringe, or whether I say to my friend who was cringe, that was so cringe, all of them have the same disciplining, normalizing function. And I don't, by the way, also think that disciplining and normalizing is always bad. I
Right.
mean, we live in a society, we need norms. So they don't all have the same effects and they aren't all exactly identical to one another, but they are all the same in as much as when we say that something is cringe, by calling it cringe and not some other adjective, we are enacting a kind of surveillance, policing surveillance that Foucault articulates quite well in Discipline and Punish. Now, that's just the first point. The second point is, I don't know that ultimately it matters whether the person is actually punished for their cringe behavior or does actually change their cringe behavior. The phenomenon of the experience of it being cringe is still the same. And as long as there is more than one person that experiences it as cringe, and I don't think that we would call anything cringe that we thought only me personally, uniquely different from everybody else in my own private personal judgments. I think this is cringe. I don't think that we would call this cringe. I think I would never call anything cringe that I didn't think other people would find cringe, because I do think that there is this like social element to it. Anytime we call something cringe, we are appealing to a kind of universality in that ought sense that we see in Kant's Critique of Judgment, that the judgment that I'm making is not my personal judgment, but this person is acting in a way that they ought not be, or that violates some kind of norm that ought to be disciplined.
I agree. The disciplining does not require punishment, hence the title Discipline and Punish. Punishment is one way of disciplining. As Foucault and others point out, we discipline one another and ourselves in all sorts of ways that don't necessarily entail punishment. And I also agree wholeheartedly that I have a relationship to the texture of grapes in my mouth that I might call cringy, except that I don't demand universality of that judgment. And so I just say, I don't like the texture of grapes. There is a universality there, a universality that I assume, as I said before, we don't do that here. And depending on how I am constituting that we, the way in which I am policing is precisely what I meant when I said it depends who the police are. If I am constituting that boundary or that border and saying, hey, we don't do that, if I'm constituting that we in such a way that is open and affirming of others and self-affirming, then I think that form of policing is great. If it's not, then I think that form of policing sucks.
I think that there are some assumptions being made that I do want to raise worries about, and that is a presumption of universality. That we don't do that around here. I want to return to the example of J.D. Vance. In some cases, when we let someone remain cringeworthy and we let them be that spectacle, it may be that that person does not belong to our we. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a presumption that we all belong to a shared we. But I think that one of the reasons why we might feel differently about Vance is that he doesn't belong to possibly our we. I know he doesn't belong to my we. There's a presumption of a kind of homogeneity that we all live amongst the same set of shared norms, but I don't know that that's true. If we think about the more dispersed and heterogeneous configurations, then I don't know that we get that exactly. And if we think about different social configurations and contestations with each other, then I think that someone who's in a different political, social arrangement can come off as cringeworthy, and you just let them be cringeworthy, and you see them as cringeworthy, but you don't see them as subject to your norms. And you don't hold them accountable to your norms, perhaps because you see them in a powerful position and you know that there's nothing that you can do about it. So you observe them as cringeworthy. And that's that. Now, in this thin sense, you may be right, I think, Lee. Still, when you say cringy, there is this normativity. We're still exerting the power of the cringe. And so to the extent that the cringe is still active, there is this sense that even amongst us, there can exist a cringe. So in that sense, I will concede it. But I do think that there is this difference where this person is in a different world, in a different social order, where they're not belonging to the same we that we are and not belonging to the same social norms that we are.
Let me just say quickly that when I was using the word we, I was totally open and expecting the fact that there is not one we. I was not saying that that claim is based on a certain homogeneity in the same way that Lee pointed out earlier on in the conversation. Kant's notion that the universality of my judgment is not an empirical fact. Although I demand it, I don't enforce that demand, and I know that it's not a universal judgment, but there is a kind of universality implicit in that.
I really love this point Talia was making about how it might be the case that sometimes we might experience something as cringe, recognize it as cringe according to a certain set of norms, but also at the same time realize that there aren't homogeneous norms, that it ought not be cringe, or one ought not experience it as cringe. And so I want to give you guys two examples. So for me, the most cringy example, and there are so many to choose from, of J.D. Vance is that moment when he was in the donut shop.
Oh
and
my
was
God, that was
talking
classic.
Yeah.
to the counter worker,
Yeah.
right? And you just watch that and you're like, this person just does not know how to interact with other human beings as a human being.
Right.
It's so cringe. And when I say it's cringe, that's not a protective response. That's not reaffirming some kind of communal standards that are threatened. It's really a judgment. I'm using it as a social weapon. I'm saying you're doing it wrong. You deserve to be laughed at. But compare that to, this is a few years ago, when people would see videos of Greta Thunberg, the young climate activist who is on the spectrum, and would say, she's so cringe. Now, I can see how people would find her activity cringe or her performance cringe because it is awkward. It is different. And yet I would want to say, yeah, okay, yes, I see why you're saying that that's cringe, but you ought not say that's cringe. There are other norms that we can adopt for how people interact socially. And while I'm talking about it, there's this great series on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum, which is about young people who are trying to find dates. I mean, it's a reality dating show for people with autism or who are on the autism spectrum. And a lot of people, I think, if they actually were in those spaces and watching those dates happen in real life experience, they would say, oh my God, this is so cringe. And actually, I imagine that a lot of people, when they watch the television show, say, oh my God, this is so cringe. But part of the point of the television show is to say, it's not cringe. It's just different. We live in a society in which there are heterogeneous norms, and we have to accept that there is no collective we, there is no collective way of always performing in exactly the same way that abides by the norms that ought not be policed. And there, I think, to get away from Nietzsche and Foucault, we can find a lot really useful in the philosopher that Talia mentioned at the top of the episode, Judith Butler. I mean, this is part of Judith Butler's discussion of performativity. A cringe moment might reveal, in fact, how fragile social scripts are, how easily the performance of a self can fail. And it might motivate us to say, oh, we need a lot of different scripts, right? There can't just be one script. So cringe not only is not universal, although I do think that whenever we call something cringe, we're implicitly invoking some kind of universal.
Yes.
But it shifts over time. What counts as cringe in one era becomes iconic or even heroic.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I'll just go back to the example I gave before, like women not wearing bras. It's context-based.
I agree wholeheartedly. And this is what I was trying to stumble into when I was talking about the constituting of a we in such a way that there's an openness, there's a recognition that there are many we's and that I might belong to many we's at the same time. And therefore, for each we, there would be a line beyond which there is cringiness, except if I'm open to the non-universality or the multiple universalities that each of us inhabit throughout our lives, then I wouldn't find some of the examples you were giving, Lee, as cringe, because they ought not be cringe if I'm open to the multiplicity of we's.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that, but I would just add the caveat, as a social person, human being existing in a human society, there is no moment in which there's nothing that you don't find cringe.
That's right.
So there's always some we that you're operating on.
Exactly.
Some norms.
Yeah, I agree.
But I mean, the notion of cringe is pretty culturally specific in and of itself, I suppose.
Well, I think it's context specific. I don't even think within a single culture that there is one notion of cringe. Just to go back to the point that you were making before, which I think is a crucially important point, but it is context specific.
Mm-hmm.
It might be historical era, it might be cultural, it might be linguistic, it might be religious, it might be many, many other things. There are many activities that are quite normal, as you both know, among philosophers at a philosophy conference, that if I were in a bar or just walking on the street, that I would find totally cringeworthy.
No, it's a cringe festival.
But we're able to suspend it at an academic conference and say, all right, but it's not cringe in this space.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, right. Maybe my suspenders are snapped. They're not working.
I don't know.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. Hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
So one of the things that we were discussing towards the end of the last segment is this idea of social scripts and ways in which doing ourselves kind of break down, and this idea of cringe really pointing to those limits and those limits of our ability to perform ourselves. And I wonder if that really gets to this deeper ontological level of what cringe is.
I think that's a really nice statement of the problem. Let's not forget about Kierkegaard,
My favorite.
who in Fear and Trembling gave us the figure of the Knight of Faith, who is somebody who appears absurd, cringe even, to the aesthetic and the ethical spheres. Because the Knight of Faith is committed to this higher, often inscrutable teleology.
Right.
So from this angle, cringe might be the tax that one pays for trying to be authentic, trying to live in faith, right? The more we risk public disapproval or mockery, the more cringe we are.
Do you think that this individual knows that they're failing?
Well, failing is relative here because they're failing aesthetically, they're failing ethically, just to keep Kierkegaard's tripartite structure.
Right.
But they're not failing faithfully.
But do they know that they're failing ethically and aesthetically? Because if they know, then are they cringe?
I don't think that to the person who is cringe, it matters what they know or don't know. Cringe comes from the other.
Yeah, but we did say that it mattered that there was a certain kind of witlessness that was crucial to cringe. That they not know that they're being cringe. The not knowing was important.
That's a funny question because, I'm thinking if I was Abraham's neighbor and Abraham comes over the morning before he goes up Mount Moriah and says to me, hey, God told me that I need to go up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice my son, I would be like, what? I feel like he's got to know that that is some cringe.
I don't know that cringe is the right word to
I
describe
agree.
No, it's
Abraham
not,
in this
but-
case.
I agree.
No. Okay, but imagine that he presents to me what he's going to do that day as this icebreaker moment or bad best man speech at a wedding. Super authentic, super sincere, super earnest, as if we're really connecting, and him telling me this story. That would be really cringe.
I just don't think this example is a good example, but I understand
Fair,
what
you're right. It's not a good example. Just funny.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, it is funny, but I just think that our judgments of Abraham in Fear and Trembling, whatever we make, I just don't know that cringe is appropriate.
Ironically enough, this is a hill that I am not going to die on, but you were asking me whether or not the Knight of Faith would know that they're cringe, and I'm trying to say that I don't think they would.
I mean, would they know that they're an aesthetic failure or an ethical failure?
Yes, I think they would.
They would. And that, to put it in Kierkegaard's terms, that's what's relevant. I mean, take a different example. Take someone who is called to philosophy. They're called to this philosophical pursuit in all of its highest forms. And so they devote themselves to philosophy, and that's all they do. Very plausibly, this person could be cringe.
Very likely, even.
Very likely. We just finished talking about the convention even, right? I mean, they're going to come off as cringe, and they're going to not know that they're cringe. They're not going to care how they're dressed. They're going to be geeking out about something. I don't know, medieval philosophy even. Medieval logic. I don't know what. I mean,
Just to pick a random
just
example.
to pick a random topic. And they're going to be talking about it loudly and passionately to strangers who walk by.
But do we even have to go that far? The three of us often say to one another, I don't agree. But when we're at a dinner party with other people and if they say something and I'm like, you know what, I could not possibly disagree more, people find that cringe. They're like, ooh, what are you doing?
Oh, yes, that's a very good example.
So I think even our everyday activity of philosophy, that is arguing, disagreeing, making judgments, searching for the truth, people find cringe.
Totally agree.
Oh, yeah, I've taken people to philosophy conferences before, and they've just like, what?
Yeah.
What is wrong with these people? Why are they acting this way?
Why are they so mean?
Why doesn't she like that person?
Why exactly? This is embarrassing. Can we leave now? This is upsetting.
But if I could get back to the question, does the cringe person know that they're cringe? I think in this instance, and maybe in every instance, I'm not sure that it really matters. It matters in terms of, for example, a friendship. If I'm being cringe, I hope that Talia, you, or Rick, you would tell me you're acting cringe, especially if you think that this is a behavior that needs to be, as we were saying before, disciplined. But I don't think it really matters ultimately that the cringe person know that they're being cringe or not know that they're being cringe in order to be cringe. Because I think the judgment cringe comes from the person witnessing the behavior.
But it's the earnestness, as you said yourself, Lee, at the outset is important. The lack of awareness and the sincerity that's key.
And I still say that. What I'm trying to say is that I don't think, for example, that I could on purpose be cringe. I think that if I were on purpose being cringe, that would be something much closer to what you described before as cringe comedy. Namely, I've crafted a behavior that I want you to experience as cringe, but is not actually the same thing as cringe. If I do know that something is cringe, then I'm just performing a comedy bit. I'm just performing a sketch. It's not actually cringe. The cringe has to involve, and I do want to now get back to this kind of ontological point that I've been trying to subtly push throughout. The cringe has to involve the witnesser of the cringe behavior somehow feeling implicated in something that they did not do. And the implication is, oh, but I could do that. So in some ways, this is a lot like tragedy. I could do that. That could happen to me. But also, more broadly, they're experiencing the fragility of social scripts altogether.
I agree with where you ended up there, but I think we can get there without having to have a concept of authenticity and the atomic individual that undergirds a concept of authenticity.
Yeah.
That I am who I am, I craft my own self independent of anyone else, and then I enter society. I can feel the fragility of being me in a social context, and I don't need the ground of authenticity lying underneath that. I find authenticity itself to be cringe.
I completely agree with that judgment. But I also want to just point out something that we haven't talked about, which is often we can experience our own behaviors as cringe, but only as if we were observing ourselves,
Right.
only by stepping outside of ourselves and saying, oh shit, did I just say that? Did I just do that?
And usually by looking back in the past and saying,
Exactly.
oh my God.
Yeah.
If it turns out to be the case that we call something cringe because we are policing a kind of border or boundary, then every instance of cringe itself points out the boundary.
Exactly.
The moment that something is cringe, suddenly I am able to, I don't always do it, but I am able to reflect, hey, what is this boundary and is it worth policing anymore? This is what makes cringe comedy so powerful. Someone can craft a way to call certain borders into question and certain boundaries into question.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of the look.
Quelle surprise, Jean-Paul Sartre enters.
Dun, dun, dun.
So, for listeners in Being Nothingness, Sartre describes this experience of being seen by another as a moment that transforms us from a subject to an object. So we become aware of ourselves as seen, as for others. And I think there might be a way in which cringe could be understood as a reversal of this moment. So we watch another person failing at being for others.
Right.
And their misfire is so dissonant, so miscalibrated, that we experience it in our own bodies. It's as if we too are being dragged into this kind of ontological unraveling of them.
Yeah.
And in that way, the cringe moment really does reveal the precariousness of all social performances. Going back to Butler, right? Identity is not a stable category. Authenticity is not a real thing. It's not a stable essence. It's an ongoing doing. It's a series of acts and, to use Butler's language, citations. So cringe happens when that doing, that repeating, that citing falters, when this script is misread or misdelivered.
I mean, there are a couple of ways in which it can falter that I think we've pointed out. One is that I perform the wrong identity in the wrong context. And another is that I miscite, got the script wrong. That's a different way in which it falters. But in all those cases, the result of the faltering is that that thing is cringe.
And another is that I don't think that there is a script
Yeah.
or context.
Yeah.
And that's the authenticity mistake. That's
Right.
the authenticity cringe, I
Right.
think.
But is it always an identity failure? Is it always a revelation of oneself coming apart? Is a mask coming off? Is a social mask coming off of looking good instead of flawed and imperfect?
I don't think it's an identity failure. I think it's a intersubjective failure. It's a sociality failure.
Right.
And it might not be a failure. I mean, it often is misjudged as a failure.
You know, so I read some of my poetry and I'm really excited about it. I come to the next podcast and I want to read you my poetry. I think it's beautiful.
I'm already cringing.
Yeah, me too.
I know, right? I'm really, really into it. It's romantic. It's just god awful, horrible. And you're really awkward and you don't know what to say. And I'm super convinced that this is fantastic. I'm reading it. I'm oversharing, going into like all this intimate stuff. Super, super cringy. What kind of failure is this exactly?
I think that that failure is the failure that we experience when the ground of our shared reality seems to kind of tremble under the weight of someone else's failed performance. And in that moment, I realize with a flash of horror how easily it could be me.
Right.
That's what I think happens in the cringe moment. So it's not about your failure. It's not about my failure. It's not about your authenticity. It's not about my authenticity. It's about a constantly shifting negotiation of intersubjectivity and sociality,
Right.
aesthetic and ethical norms, and how fragile, how unsteady all of that is.
But what has gone wrong? What has missed the mark?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure that we can always clearly articulate what has gone wrong. And that's why I want to go all the way back to the beginning. One of the really, maybe truly unique things about this concept cringe is that it's not simply aesthetic. It's not simply moral or ontological. It's also affective. And so I'm not so sure that we can easily describe the relationship between our affective response and these moral, aesthetic, ontological, social dimensions that we've been talking about.
And I also wonder how important it is to give definition to the category cringe to pinpoint exactly what the failure consists in. That is, if we say that this is a failure of socialization in which a performance has gone wrong, that seems to be a sufficient definition of cringe. And then I can say, and there are all sorts of ways that could go wrong. And I think we've pointed some out. I used the wrong script in the wrong context. I misquote the script.
I don't know how to order donuts.
I don't know how to order donuts, for example. All of these could be ways in which there is a faltering. I like that much better than failure, Lee.
Faltering, yeah.
The faltering is nice because, you didn't just fail. There's something more tragic about an out-and-out failure, but there's this faltering that I think is key here. And this can happen in many ways, but I do like the notion that it involves the moral, the aesthetic, and the ontological, at least.
I'm not looking for a definition. I'm looking for a deeper account in some sense, because when we're pushing towards what you call the intersubjective, so the interpersonal, there's a self-display. There's a lack of awareness about some kind of lack of fit of the self-display within that interpersonal moment. Like there's a kind of dialogical failure about the expectations in that dialogical moment. So we think that there's a context, a setting for dialogical engagement where we interact with each other and we engage in back and forth, where we display ourselves to each other, where we attend to each other back and forth, and that's set or fixed. In this moment, there's an overshooting of that or a misread of that and a lack of awareness of that. I mean, I don't know if that can be generalized, but that does seem to characterize a lot of this. I hear what you're saying, Lee, where we want to understand this as intersubjective or interpersonal, that type of faltering. So it's got to be a kind of dialogical faltering. There's a back and forth thing where something is going wrong. And that seems also critical, particularly if you're either witnessing it, if you're in the room, or worse, expected to reply to it. That's got to figure, I think, into the underlying account of what's happening interpersonally.
I really like this point. I think that what I would want to say is that although the experience of cringe is, in its own rather unique way, dialogical, in as much as it involves intersubjectivity, social and political norms, moral norms, aesthetic norms, etc., that the actual moment of cringe is not dialogical.
It's a failure or a faltering of it.
Exactly right. Faltering of dialogue, right? So even if I say to you afterwards, hey, Talia, that was really cringe, we're now in a different register. We're now speaking in a different domain. We're dialoguing about cringe, about a moment. We're not in the cringe moment.
But sort of set within the context of that which was supposed to be dialogical.
Exactly.
But there was a faltering.
Right.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, you guys, this has been awkward, but not cringe. And what is cringe is that our bartender just came over and plopped our check down right in front of me, dramatically and authentically, and said, you got to get out of here.
Now, what would definitely be cringe is if I started singing Closing Time authentically at the top of my lungs.
I double dare you, Rick.
Closing time.
Do it, Rick.
Do it, Rick, do it.
We're such terrible friends, Talia.
This is a callback to an earlier season. Julia Kristeva covering the song Closing Time. Closing time, one last call for alcohol. So finish your whiskey and beer. closing time. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
I'm so dead. Oh my god. Good night.
Cringe.
Please get out of here. It's so
This is the
cringe.
perfect ending. Thank you, Rick.
If you become a Patreon patron, you can have access to my entire album of Chris Davok covers.